Great. I think we're going to go ahead and get started this evening. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you in the room and to the many people that we have joining us online virtually. It's really a pleasure to be here this evening. My name is Sherry Ryan, and I'm the Dean of the Austin W. Marks School of Public and International Affairs. We're thrilled this evening to be holding the Lily and Nathan Ackerman lecture series on equality and justice tonight here in person and virtually. We appreciate all of you for joining us to learn about Professor Russell's important research on LGBTQ plus youth and schooling. So we thank you for being here, Professor Russell. This lecture series would not be possible without the generous donation of the Engelman family. And we are happy to have with us here tonight a member of the Engelman family, Marianne Lotto. She'll be providing a brief overview of the mission and history of the Ackerman lecture series, and so I would like to now introduce Marianne Lotto. I'll say a few words about her and then let her join in. Marianne's career as a lawyer and academic has been devoted to civil rights and environmental justice. Her experience includes 10 years as general counsel of New York Lawyers for the Public Interest, which is a nonprofit civil rights law firm, and she served also as a senior staff attorney at Earth Justice. More recently, she's directed environmental and climate justice clinics at Vermont Law School, as well as at Yale Law School, where she was tapped to join the Biden administration. She currently serves as a principal deputy assistant administrator at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. She's lectured widely and taught graduate law and undergraduate level courses. Her most recent writing focuses on civil rights enforcement in the environmental justice context and the role of lawyers in community-based movements for social change. So please join me in welcoming Marianne Lotto.
Hi there, thanks so much. I bring deep appreciation from the Engelman family, which created this lecture series in honor of my grandparents. The one piece of my bio that perhaps I'm as proud of as anything else is the time I spent with the Marks School on faculty, and I'm deeply appreciative of all that goes on at the Marks School and proud of that time. Thank you to the Marks School Dean, Sherry Ryan, to Professor Robert Smith, the Ackerman Chair, and our Ackerman lecturer tonight, Professor Stephen Russell. I'm looking forward to his remarks. My deep appreciation to all of you in the room tonight. I wish I could be with you in person, but come to you from Washington. And it's the power of Zoom that allows me to be in two places at once. And to all of you also who are enduring more time on Zoom to join us, many thanks. A big thanks also to Diana Lazoff, who made all of this happen. Finally, while I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the Engelman family, I also want to recognize the vision of my parents, Erwin and Rosalind Engelman, who did make the Ackerman lecture series possible. They're also on Zoom tonight. The idea of the lecture series was to create a space where we grapple with issues of equality and justice. My grandparents, Nathan and Lily Ackerman, for whom this lecture series is named, came to this country from Poland and Russia as a refuge. And though they had a hard life, they felt it was a land of opportunity for their families, particularly for their children and their children's children. Their children and grandchildren were everything to them. And they taught us the values and practices of sacrifice, love, and care for the next generation. Now I'm going to tell you a sort of intimate story, but it's a true story. My grandmother, who was in her 90s the last time I saw her, her health was failing, but I am sure she lived those final months just so she could see my son born. He was born 2 months before she passed away. She held him in her arms during his baby naming ceremony. And afterward, I went back to her room before leaving that day. Didn't know it was the last time I would see her. And as I was saying goodbye, we somehow got into a conversation about whether and when I would return to work after maternity leave. I kissed her goodbye. And then as I was walking down the hall, the very last word she said to me, almost sort of a voice from beyond coming down the hall, which I took as a note of caution about returning to work. Her last words were, "A baby needs his mama." I kid you not, those were her very last words to me. "A baby needs his mama." I tell you this story because it gives me great guilt, but also because care for our children is part of the legacy of Nathan and Lily Ackerman. And we as a society have an obligation to protect and care for our children. That's something they taught us. Not just our own children, but collectively the next generation. We've been through a lot these last few years. COVID brought fear and isolation for young and old. Yet we're only beginning to understand the impacts of this time on our children, not just from COVID, but from a myriad social pressures. Being a child or teenager today, and I happen to be close to a number of children and teenagers, is very challenging. And we also know that going through this time while struggling with sexual identity and bullying in particular can be devastating. I can think of few topics more timely and more relevant to the issues of equality and justice than research and policy on the LGBTQ plus youth population. In that spirit, I'm now going to turn off my mic and look forward to tonight's lecture. On behalf of the family, many thanks.
Thank you so much, Marianne. We really appreciate your words this evening, and the Mark School very much appreciates your family's contributions to the work that we do. Next, I'd like to introduce Professor Rob Smith, who's currently serving as the Lillian and Nathan Ackerman Chair for the Mark School. He is part of an emerging group of scholars practicing publicly engaged sociology. For Smith, this means identifying strategic sites of intervention and using cutting-edge social science research to both understand processes at work that produce inequality and injustice at those sites, as well as to understand mechanisms for improving outcomes at those sites. He's principal investigator on the DACA Access Project, which is a long-term project that analyzes the effects of having or lacking, of gaining or losing legal status, and how that influences education, health, family dynamics, and interactions with police. Smith serves on the board of the educational and organizing nonprofit MASA for 20 years. He served as an expert witness in Voting Rights Act cases, in a case against Wells Fargo, and in deportation defense and other cases. Throughout the pandemic, he has worked closely with an immigrant organization analyzing how the pandemic has impacted the well-being of immigrants and their families. So please join me in welcoming Professor Rob Smith. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry, very much. And thank you, Rosalind, and please say hi to Roz and Irwin. We hope that we can see you back in person in the spring. And thank you to the Engelman family for the endowment that makes this lecture series possible. And thank you to Diana and everyone who has helped to set this up today. We really appreciate all your work. And thank you for everybody in Zoom land who's tuning in. We have a small but loyal crowd here, but I know there's a many times bigger crowd elsewhere. So it is my great pleasure, was my great pleasure to invite, and is my great pleasure to introduce today Stephen Russell, who is the Priscilla Pond Flawn Regents Professor in Child Development and Chair of the Department of Human Development and Family Services, and the Amy Johnson McLaughlin Director of the School of Human Ecology at UT Austin. He's an expert in adolescent and young adult health with a focus on sexual orientation and gender identity. His 2016 book, Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity, and Schooling, The Nexus of Research, Practice, and Policy, won awards from the American Psychological Association and the Society for Research on Adolescence. He has served on the governing boards of the Society for Research in Child Development, National Council on Family Relations, and is an elected fellow, and the Council on Contemporary Families, Sex Ed for Social Change, and the Society for Research on Adolescence, of which he served as president from 2012 to 2014. Stephen is also the co-creator of the Stories and Numbers Project, which uses academic research in applied ways to create more inclusive and safe pedagogy and environments for all youth. And I think one of the, so that's just Stephen's formal biography. I'll tell you a couple of other things. Stephen is a leader in a movement towards more publicly engaged sociology and other kinds of social research. Most of us go to graduate school to get PhDs thinking that our work is going to help make the world better. But yet our careers, academic careers and academic institutions guide us quite forcefully away from using our research that time, in those ways. In fact, it's even sanctioned against in many ways, especially before you get tenure. But there are concrete changes in policies and practices that we can make to create a structure in and around academic careers and institutions that would make those things better, and that would promote more publicly engaged work. Oh, look at that. I look like I'm standing up straight now. That's such a better, thank you so much. It was quite distracting. You guys couldn't see this, but the top of my head was cut off in the monitor. I kept thinking I should bend down. Yeah, okay. So was my head actually cut off? Oh, okay. See, that's all right. So now I can go. I can stand up a little straighter. But one of the things that one of the key reasons that I wanted to invite Stephen to give this lecture is, I mean, he's, as you heard, he's an amazing researcher. He's a pioneer in this field. But when I started to read more of his work, I also realized that his sort of commitments as a public intellectual and professor were very similar to my own, in that we want our work to actually make a difference. And I think one of the most important enactments I've ever seen of this work is the Stories in Numbers Project, which not only fosters and promotes cutting-edge research, but also creates tools for LGBTQ youth and children and parents and administrators and allies to help those children find their way and to defend their rights. It's a key human rights issue, and I can think of no better speaker as the Ackerman speaker for this year than Stephen Russell. So thank you very much, and please join me in welcoming Stephen Russell.
I am so glad to be here, and there have been so many thanks, and I feel like I need to add to all the thanks. Diana, you made it all. You make all the magic happen. Thank you, and thank you, Rob, for that great introduction. Today, in thinking about what I wanted to talk about with you all today, in this thinking about LGBT, I guess I need to do my thing. Let me make sure I can figure out how to do this. I've got to start sharing my screen. I think if I minimize, it's not going to mess everything up. I think it worked. Okay, we're going to see how this goes. And people in Zoom land, you can talk to Diana and let her know if you can't see me. But I want to talk with you about the work I've been doing. Oh, I need to share too. It's always something. Is it the right one? Okay. All right, I'm gonna.
A little closer. I was gonna raise your volume a little higher.
Okay.
Let's just
Is
bring
this-
it closer.
Okay. How's that? And so chat and let us know if it's working okay. So I've been thinking, well, since I was a graduate student, so before that, about how research could be useful for policy and practice. And I started this work on trying to understand LGBTQ young people at the beginning of my career, when I was trying to understand myself as an LGBTQ young person. So in this talk, I want to spend a little bit of time at the beginning talking about the things I've been grappling with in the last decade in terms of, from the human developmental perspective, understanding how what the developmental science tells us today about the lives of LGBTQ young people, because I think there's some complications and paradoxes that are not understood well in the public. And then I want to turn and talk about this work on kind of advancing educational equity and what we can do to create safe and supportive environments. And I just think this is it's so thrilling to think that Lily and Nathan Ackerman had, that their family had this idea of a lectureship on equality and justice. It's wonderful, and it's great to be here. So the big picture right now, the moment we're in the short-term moment, meaning the last 5 years and the last 9 months, you might know this. You might not know the specifics or the details, but since January, there have been more than 300 anti-LGBTQ legislation pieces of legislation introduced in state legislatures in 42 states in the United States. Many, if actually most of those bills focus on LGBTQ young people and schools. That number is more than the past 5 years combined. So this is a year that game on in terms of like the affront to LGBTQ youth and rights. A lot of attention has been on some people are familiar with the Florida Don't Say Gay law, as it's called. It's the deliberately vague language prohibits instruction on sexual orientation or gender identity in kindergarten through third grade, so no instruction at all. And then beyond those grades, beyond third grade, prohibits instruction in a manner that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate for students in accordance with state standards. So the trouble, of course, and I'm in a school of public affairs, so you all know this better than I do, but the trouble, of course, is that those are incredibly vague parameters for a state law. And so the power is that it's ill-defined, and it's caused education actors in the state of Florida to move with extreme caution to avoid legal entanglements, because the law specifically ties violations of the law to state funding for public education. So, for example, this summer, the Orange County School District staff members told teachers that they could not display pride flags or photos of their same-sex spouses in their classrooms. They later retracted and said, well, it was just an example, but that is an example of the kind of chilling effect that's happened in Florida. And another school district sent out a message requiring folks to take down safe zone stickers, because safe zone is perceived to be, safe zone and the colors of a rainbow are perceived to be in violation of that state law. And another, I heard from advocates called me to tell me their frustration that in another school district that last year had 38 Gender Sexuality Alliance school clubs, GSA clubs, only has 2 this year because teachers are like, don't know what to do, and are throwing their hands up in the air in terms of supporting that. So what is troubling, and I mean, obviously that's troubling, but what's complicated about it is that it comes after decades where there was felt to be substantial and seemingly cumulative social and legal change toward inclusion and acceptance of sexual and gender minority people. And we're all familiar with this. And in fact, it's hard to think, in my view, I would submit that it's hard to think of other societal values or beliefs that have changed so much and so quickly. And so this is one of my favorite examples, if it works. Okay, we're gonna see if it works. Now that works. Okay. This is a question from the General Social Survey that was asked to some of you. I don't put this question up here just so that I can make you wonder. This is this great question that was started to be asked in 1973. Some of you might know why we would have started asking this question of the General Social Survey in 1973. What about a man who admits that he is a homosexual? Should such a person be allowed to teach in a college or university or not? These are the nots. So in 1973, 48% of U.S. adults believed that some of us should not be allowed to teach in colleges or university. And in 40 years, that is now, it's still 4%. I mean, 4% seems like a lot of people, in my humble opinion, but it's only 4%. For elementary school teachers, the numbers are staggering, from 88% of U.S. adults opposed to the homosexual elementary school teacher to fewer than 10% now, still 10%. So all of that's in less than a generation. So in almost 50 years, this is what I think of as a staggering pace of social change. And from a period of almost complete silence and invisibility, for example, when I was growing up in rural Texas, to legal and societal acceptance only a half century later. So what that has meant, and I think what a lot of us understand conceptually about that, is that there's been this dramatic change and historically new possibility to understand our lives as LGBTQ people. And what we've seen is this dramatic change in the age of coming out. So this is a graph that shows the average ages of disclosure of a same-sex identity when we started having these studies. So one of the very first studies was in 1979, where the average age was between 20 and 21. And these lines across the middle at 14 and 18 sort of represent high school, the high school period. And we sort of see that in the 80s and 90s, the average age of coming out was about in high school. And then starting at about 2000, the average age of coming out dipped into the middle school years and is about 14, and then that seems to be about the case now in studies. These are studies of a range of different methods and cross-sectional approaches to understanding coming out. And so this is game-changing in terms of, in human developmental terms, and many people have presumed that the vulnerabilities that we knew in research for many years would be overcome in younger cohorts. And maybe I should have said this at the beginning, but I kind of sometimes assume one of the things lots of people know about sexual minority children, about lesbian, gay, bisexual children, is that they're vulnerable to suicide and other mental health problems and other behavioral risks. And I should say that we've known that for 40 years. And so many people have presumed that those vulnerabilities would be dissipating, that things are better. And there was a famous trope about it gets better about a decade ago. And in fact, things are socially and legally certainly better and changed. But there is a paradox when comparing the arc of social change with what's going on with the health status of sexual and gender minority young people today. And I don't, I could talk for hours and hours about this, and I'm going to try to do this quickly. This graph is one example using data from the British Columbia Adolescent Health Survey, PS, in Canada. They started before we did in the United States, including questions about sexual identity on population level health monitoring surveys. So back in 1998, they started to ask the sexual identity question. And this is 15 years of data showing, among other things, that smoking has decreased, has dropped. Rates of smoking have dropped for all young people in Canada. It's true across all of North America and the United States. So this is general good news. Young people smoke less than they did, 2 decades, 3 decades ago, 4 decades ago. This data shows the graph for girls, but the problem with the graph is that the disparity, I don't know if you can see that very well in this slide, but the disparity is not gotten, if things were getting better, that disparity ought to be getting narrower, not wider. And this was one of the first, this paper is really, doesn't seem that old to me now, but it's one of the first where we started to say, hey, we have historical trend data that we can historical cross-sectional studies that we can start looking at trends in health behavior and see if there's a change in disparities for sexual gender minority kids. This was for girls and for smoking, but we've seen this for boys. We see the same pattern now in studies that have documented this same pattern of widening disparities, or stable disparities at least, in alcohol, marijuana, other substances, disordered eating, and depression and suicide. Studies of bullying, on the other hand, show a different pattern. On one hand, general victimization, victimization in the general population of adolescents in the United States has declined over time, and that's generally good news. The disparity for sexual and gender minority kids has not. So sexual and gender minority kids are more likely to be victims of bullying and harassment in schools. But homophobic bullying in particular has not declined, and there's a bit of a debate, but most of the data suggests that it's increased over the last several decades. So there's less general victimization in the adolescent world, but there's more homophobic victimization, and it seems to be concentrated, in other words, we seem to be concentrating discrimination through victimization. So what hasn't changed, or in some cases what's worse, is discrimination or bullying. And I want to really underscore here a tiny little side note to say it's not just, and so much of my shtick and research on adolescence is we think so much at the person level. And I want to emphasize that it's not just discrimination by peers, but this kind of prejudice and discrimination is embedded in our institutions. It's structural. And so consider, for example, discipline that punishes students by removing them from school, by actually excluding them from their education, which in the education world is, school suspension we take as a normal practice in the United States, but if you really think about what it's doing, it's actually it's preventing young people from access to their education. And this is a figure that shows over 500,000 students in 1,000 California schools in 2015. And an important thing I want to say too is that these are rates that are calculated after controlling for the behaviors that should get you suspended. So these are rates that are adjusted for alcohol, marijuana, or drug use at school, for being in a fight or damaging school property, or for skipping school. So taking away all the naughty behavior, the suspendable behavior, we see that on an average, 1.5% of California kids say that they were suspended in the last 30 days, but LGBT youth are more than twice as likely, and transgender youth are more than 3 times as likely. So this is not peers. This is embedded in the structure of schools, that the LGBTQ kids are more likely to be the ones that are pushed out. And these disparities or the differences in the school experiences aren't random. And it's even worse and maddening and infuriating when we look at the intersection of LGBTQ with race and ethnicity. And here we see that Asian and white LGBT youth are somewhat more likely to be suspended from school, but the dramatic differences are concentrated among LGBTQ youth of color, with more than 7% of Black LGBTQ youth saying that they were suspended, which is more than 4.5 times the average. So disparities aren't random. Discrimination is not random, and discrimination is intersectional. And I insert this here because I want to make sure that when we're talking about LGBTQ disparities for young people, we're talking about, we must think intersectionally. We have to understand that we're talking about the ways that LGBTQ plays out at the intersection of race, class, gender. So if we go back and think about these sort of patterns in historical context, and I'm putting over that, the general social survey, that in dramatic trend and social attitudes with the average age of coming out. What does all this mean? And this is something that really bothered me for a long time. And Jessica Fish is a professor at the University of Maryland, and we've been thinking about an idea that we call developmental collision, which is a tension between the fundamental developmental processes that all young people experience being a teenager, what it means to grow up, what middle school and high school mean for young people, combined with the changing personal and social and structural possibilities that have rearranged discrimination for sexual and gender minority people and have maybe focused or even accentuated it during adolescence. What do I mean by this? So I'm saying at the same time that the possibility to understand yourself as LGBTQ has happened and young people can come out at younger ages, there's a collision with the developmental processes that are happening during adolescence. And what it means is that coming out is happening at a really new time now. Intrapersonally, I have a little heuristic. And this sort of radiating rings around a young person. Think of, if for those of you who are developmentalists, think of Urie Bronfenbrenner and the Bronfenbrenner socio-ecological model. But at the intrapersonal level, late childhood is defined by adrenarchy, the changes that happen before puberty that lead to the development of metacognition, thinking about one's thoughts, thinking about other people's thoughts, thinking about what those people are thinking about me and my thoughts. That is a hallmark of adolescence that is beginning literally at this age when young people are now coming out. And it plays a crucial role in heightened self-consciousness and self-awareness, which affects the interpersonal, the interactions that young people have every day with themselves and the world. This heightened sense of self-consciousness is related to, is the underpinnings of peer victimization. It's why peer victimization is highest in middle school in the United States. And it's compounded for LGBTQ youth because that self-consciousness, there are few things more compelling for social regulation, for fitting in, for learning about who you are than sex and gender. Learning what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man. All that's happening in a contextual and institutional settings that, frankly, were not really set up to understand LGBTQ young people. So in previous cohorts, LGBT people came out when they were adults, when they were financially, legally, and socially independent from their parents or caregivers. I came out when I was 26. I was starting a postdoc. I was financially independent of my parents and could literally think, okay, peace out, it'll be all right. At their reaction to my coming out. It would have been very different had I been 12 or 14 or 16 when I'd had that conversation with them. And imagine the next 2, 6, 8 years of my life living with them in their home, right? And we know that that coming out, that as young people are dependent on their families, we know that there's a meta story of families adjusting, if not also being rejecting and victimizing of LGBTQ kids. I mean, of course, there's the other story too of celebration and acceptance, but we still know that families, that LGBTQ young people navigate coming out and home. And then at schools, a whole separate story is how what a mess we have in our structural institutions for schooling, that just at the time when self-consciousness, when cognitive development is changing, we move from the elementary school structure of a literally the roots of it were a family-based homeroom style setting, to disrupt peer social networks in middle school and high school, where you have more complex class structure, more interaction with more separate, individuated teacher situations, movement between classes, literal disruption in all of the networks, just at a time when young people are more sensitive to connection and more sensitive to regulation and social control. So it's not surprising that it's the time that of the transition in particular that is linked to things like school bullying and victimization. And then above all of this, there's this larger discourse. There's a larger culture where LGBT issues have been present in the culture constantly. I mean, really, for those of you who remember, like Ellen came out. Before Ellen came out, what year was that? Before Ellen, 1995, something. Before Ellen came out, there was, it was like, it was Billy Crystal on Soap, that was years before that. I mean, there was like deafening silence. And within a year, there was no such thing as a show that didn't have a gay foil of some a gay character playing some role of some kind. And the political discourse has been intense. And so, and frankly, when people say to me, like, hey, marriage, when people in 2015, I think really literally would say to me, aren't we done now? Like, all better. Forgetting, not realizing that the years of progress toward the Supreme Court decision in summer of 2015 was characterized by social, political, media discourse that was constant about your value as a citizen, about your worth as a person to have a family. I mean, that's what that was. So imagine growing up as a kid and hearing that all the time. And like maybe the outcome seems kind of liberatory, but the process sure was brutal for many people who lived through it. I think, okay, side story. I think of my first study of LGBT youth, my first qualitative study of LGBT youth in California in the 90s, late 90s, before all this marriage thing, when the ballot amendments were popular in states to limit marriage, and California had one of the early ballot amendments, and I was interviewing, doing a focus group with LGBT young people, and a young woman, a high school girl from a small town in the valley in California, described getting up in the morning, going to school, and coming back from school, and people had been through the neighborhood with protect marriage signs, and she described walking down her street, passing the house by house by house of the people she'd known her entire life, and seeing those signs that they had put in their house, and like feeling sicker and sicker and sicker as she was walking to her home, and thinking, I have to walk past this every single day for the rest of the, every single day until this darn election is done and these signs come down. So that is what it like feels like to be a kid. I mean, from the perspective of an old white guy. But it's what worries me so much about this year, because these disparities that I've shown you that have gotten worse, not better, are in the context of times that are before now. And now is pretty bad, especially if you're gender different, if you're trans and gender diverse right now. And we know this from data on adults. We know that LGBT adults that lived in states that had ballot amendments had, compromised psychological well-being compared to LGBT adults that lived in states that didn't. We know those things. So on the one hand, societal changes have created these possibilities for sexual minority kids to understand themselves in ways that were never before possible, and that's extraordinary and amazing. And the typical developmental experiences of their lives encountered at the same time that their understanding and their emerging sexualities and gender understandings, I think, leave them vulnerable to the kinds of mental and behavioral health risks that we've known for a very long time and that we thought might be getting better. Okay, so everybody take a big, deep breath with me, because this is the really bad news. This is the low point. This is the bad news. It's really not very good news, and it doesn't make me very happy, right? So what can we do about it? And here's the thing. We have really good news. I mean, the thing that is making me so angry right now is we have really good news, and it's complete, like all the stuff that's coming out in legislative proposals is complete affront to what we know matters for making schools safe for LGBTQ young people, but frankly, for all young people. I mean, the data actually show there are times when the policies that we think are going to make a difference for inclusion for LGBTQ young people actually make schools safer for the straight kids. The straight kids get a bigger bump than the LGBTQ ones. Okay, I digress. So we know that we need to shift. I've been arguing that we need to shift. I wonder if I've even paid attention to my slides. Oh, I have. Good. So here's the framework that we have been working with in Texas and other places, but our focus had largely been in Texas, called Stories and Numbers, and you can check out storiesandnumbers.org, that is trying to distill this, really decade plus, 30 years, but really the incredible explosion of our evidence and knowledge has been in the last 10 to 15 years. And we have, arranged this in a colorful framework that we hope can be accessible to especially school personnel, teachers, parents, but also young people themselves, to tell their stories and have evidence to back up, evidence for research to help them tell their story in articulating change, particularly in a place like Texas. So we have learned a lot. This is the thing that is super important to me. We couldn't say all this stuff a decade ago, and now we have evidence for it about the policies and practices that make a difference. So these include inclusive and enumerated policies, and I'm in a public affairs school, so I probably don't have to explain all that, but a lot of, it means explicitly including sexual orientation and gender identity and expression in non-discrimination and anti-bullying laws and policies. And there's a great body of work that spans from the individual to the comparing state policies and average student experiences within those states that shows that if a kid says they have a policy that's inclusive, they feel safer than a kid that says they don't have the policy. If a kid lives in a district that has a policy, they're safer than a kid in a district that doesn't have a policy. And if you live in a state that has a statewide policy, you see what I'm getting at. There's a whole literature on this now. The second area is support and training for school personnel, working with teachers on how to be supportive and how to address discrimination when it happens in the classroom. I think we think it's intuitive, but figuring out how to teach and how to both be an expert at teaching math and physics or language arts or whatever you teach, and teach equity and inclusion is not intuitive. Like, neither is physics. So we need to engage teachers in that and training and supporting them to do that. I've mentioned student-led clubs like Gender Sexuality Alliances, used to be called Gay Straight Alliances. There's a kind of remarkable body of research on that now, and what we see is when students provide the leadership to create positive change in their own schools, they feel safer and everybody in the school feels safer. One of the compelling stories about GSAs is that the multiple studies now show you don't even have to be in it. I think at the beginning of doing some of the research, I thought, well, you got to be a member of the GSA to get the benefit of the GSA. And what we show now with huge data, big data in California, showing that the presence of a GSA in school matters independent of whether you're in it or not. So the GSA is a signal for a climate that is inclusive. And then finally, access to LGBTQ-related resources and curricula. this is curricular inclusion, learning about LGBTQ issues in the classroom, but it's also the everyday stuff like books in the library and posters on the wall. I haven't yet seen, I want someone to do a study where they literally go and they count, they talk with young people about literally the things in their visual environment. But it is, that move by the school district this summer to tell teachers to take down safe zone stickers is, tells you something about the anxieties around the power that is felt in the visual representation. And we've known this since the 1970s. We knew with, Black History Month, those very early studies that showed representation, like seeing yourself on the wall or reading about yourself in the book, makes you more likely want to be there, makes you more likely to be engaged, makes you more likely to show up. So we know that we know these matter. I'm going to give a couple empirical examples, and then I'm going to try to wind this down. But because partly it's that maybe it's showing off, but like I'm so excited about this new work because it is the evidence that we have not had until very recently. Like this is a really recent study with Meg Bishop, who is an amazing postdoc at University of Maryland now, but just finished their PhD at UT with me, where we had a data geek, happy moment where we combined independent databases, students' reports on victimization and school climate in 2015 in California from 55,000 students in 150 schools, with school district data from 2004 and 2014. So we had school district data on whether the principal said that they had inclusive training for teachers in 2004 and 2014. And then we had victimization and homophobic bullying data in 2015. So what we found essentially is that, and what the figure shows, is that in schools with supportive training in both years for a decade, having sustained training for teachers, LGBTQ students reported the lowest rates of victimization. So and the effect size is it looks, it's like a graph and it's like, okay, it's a little bit lower, but if you think about the population level, what this means for exposure to victimization, it's a huge number. It's a big difference, a big measurable difference, and I should calculate that before I just say that online. But that's what I'm going to do next. Maybe it's even in the paper. But it's evidence that training teachers, engaging teachers, and understanding and supporting LGBTQ young people is an effective way to create safe and supportive schools for young people. And the Florida law is obviously, precisely wrong. An example from GSA's, and it's a stark example with data from 4 million youth in California over 15 years using the California Healthy Kids Survey, tracing homophobic bullying. And I'm giving it all away in one slide, but what it shows, it's the first population level quasi-experimental design that shows that's a school protective factor like a GSA having a population level effect in lowering bullying. What it essentially shows is the trend in homophobic bullying for schools that had a GSA in the blue line and schools that didn't have a GSA. And the inflection, when I first saw the line, my grad student said, like, oh, there's something wrong with the data because there's this big peak in 2008, and my jaw dropped. I said, what? She said, there's a big peak in 2008, there must be something wrong with the data. 2008 was the year of Prop 8. And this is a perfect exponential increase up to 2008 and a monotonic decrease thereafter. And the blue line, the schools that have GSAs, are a flat line. And it's literally, this completely maps on to the years of rhetoric that led up to the Prop 8 vote that frankly disappeared after Prop 8, was resolved, after the thing was resolved and became the law of California. And there was this sort of decline in homophobic bullying thereafter. We tested the counterfactuals for other forms of bullying, for race-based bullying, for religious-based bullying. We see no differences in the trends, and we see no differences in schools with or without GSAs. So it's like really good evidence, as far as I'm concerned, for a population intervention like a GSA to make a big difference. And I think, anyway, this is another one that makes me think about this, kid who was going to school every day, walking past the anti-marriage, the protect marriage signs. And then in terms of like what we learn in schools, this is one where my wonderful friend advocates for those of you who are like maybe in the Zoom audience or here who think about statistics, I was doing, this is a multi-level model where we were trying to disentangle person effects and school level effects, and we found a stronger school level effect of learning about LGBT issues in school. In other words, that pattern where you don't have to have learned about it yourself. If more kids around you have learned about it, you feel, you report fewer mean rumors or lies being made less fun of, and lower LGBT bullying. And it was a great moment with advocates, because I was like, oh, I was trying to explain this multi-level model. And they were like, it sounds, I was like, yeah, maybe it's a geeky thing. And I don't, and they said, no, it actually sounds like it's important if you could only figure out how to explain that, Stephen. And anyway, this is it's this very simple, but I was so happy with myself for coming up with this heuristic to say, like, let's just, instead of trying to present an HLM model, let's just divide the sample by the kids who were in schools where more than half or less than half actually learned about LGBTQ issues in the classroom. And it turned out the data worked out that way, consistent with our much more sophisticated statistical modeling. So it's good news. Like, being in a school where this is part of the discourse is associated with less discrimination and harassment. And then I think I have time. I'm going to just do it quickly, show you this one, because I'm here. I'm kind of going back to the first policy. I was debating leaving this in, but I'm going to do it. Talk about it anyway, because this is a fairly new paper that I think is so important at a place like a School of Public Affairs, because litigation. California passed its inclusive education law in 1999. It went into effect in January 2000. And this study tracks litigation to address violations of that law starting after 2000. And we examined whether litigation is a strategy that's associated with homophobic bullying in 500 schools with 1.4 million kids, using all that California data. And we basically restricted the analyses to school districts where there was a case in the sample, where a child or typically their parents were suing a school for violations of the state law. Usually, almost all of the cases were LGBT bullying, but there were some other cases that weren't specific to bullying. But basically, for failure to keep an LGBTQ young person safe in their school. Basically, we observe an 18% reduction in homophobic bullying in the years during the case, and a 27% reduction in bullying after the case. The reason this is so interesting and frankly exciting to me is that nobody studies litigation. I mean, litigation is a strategy that individuals, families, communities have to address civil rights violations, but we don't actually have much social scientific evidence about whether it's a good idea or not. Like, you may get a settlement for you as an individual, but does it actually matter for your school and your district? And this is the first evidence that I'm aware of that shows that the litigation strategy actually is associated with at least a short-term reduction in homophobic bullying for the school. We also find spillover effects in the district, which is super, super exciting to me in terms of like proof of concept. And frankly, the lawyer folks are super excited about it, because they're like, we do this stuff, but we don't know if it causes more harm than good. Like, we might get a good outcome for our client, but do we know if it's a good thing for students? And in this, for students and for schools. And in this study, we also tested other forms of bullying to assure that the counterfactuals weren't, and we don't find the same effect for race-related, religion, or gender-related bullying. So we do think this is isolated to homophobic bullying. I'll start to wrap this up by saying I think that we do have good news about what works to create safe and supportive schools for young people, and I do think, as a little bit frankly overwhelming in the last year it's been to be in Texas and to be a person that does research and gets called by folks like People Magazine kind of people to ask for my opinion about the Florida law, or to hear from the families that I know personally and well in Texas and the issues that they're facing. I do think that this kind of strategy and working in community is productive and hopeful for engaging young people in their communities to become part of the grassroots change that we can imagine. I want to share before ending a shout out for these two important recent reports by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. In 2019, the National Academies released The Promise of Adolescence, Realizing Opportunity for All Youth, which was a study that was motivated by trying to really integrate the dramatic new science on the adolescent brain with the social and behavioral sciences of adolescence. And then a year later, a report on understanding the well-being of LGBTQ plus populations. Both of these are available and downloadable for free from the National Academies. All you have to do is give them your email address, and there are worse people to get email from than the National Academies. And they really don't send that many email, I promise you. But the data I've shared today, some of it, not the newest, but some of the data that I've shared today, but in particular that framework from Stories and Numbers is reflected in in both of these reports. And it's so important to me just to underscore, we've never before had a body of science to support an understanding of what schools and communities can do to undermine discrimination, to mitigate prejudice, and to support the well-being of LGBTQ young people. And it's the first time we've had scientific consensus about it. And frankly, it's the first time that the National Academies have said anything this assertive about LGBTQ young people in both of these contexts. And so I'm really proud of that and hope that you'll check it out and let other people know that we have evidence for what makes a difference. And we should be thinking about how that evidence gets used. So I will wrap up there and end on a slide of gratitude for funders and the incredible team of people that have worked with me over the years and that I've cited in this talk, and welcome conversation and discussion. So I think now we're transitioning to there.
The format is we now go to the Dick Cavett Show.
Okay.
And,
Do I need to say okay? Okay.
and Diana will bring us the questions from the chat. And so far, so good. Stephen, this is me. Oh, I do need to do this, don't I? All right. So, thank you very much. So everybody here in the audience heard what the format's going to be. I'm going to repeat the instructions for the people in Zoom land. Diana will bring us up questions from the chat, and I will put the questions to Stephen and otherwise facilitate conversation. But let me ask first if there are questions from people in the audience, and I will repeat your question to the people in Zoom land. Michael Seltzer, I know you have a question. I can see you writing. And sir, you raised your hand first. Go ahead.
I was wondering, is there any data about the shift of attention in the high school population and the middle school population from mainstream TV to social media? Because mainstream TV, if you watch that, nobody's going to bully anybody. So what is provoking the bullying in their lives?
So the question, before Stephen answers, the question was, and I'm going to paraphrase you, sir, has there been research on what the impact of the dominant media, social media that young people engage with, being from TV to being social media, because on regular TV, people are not bullied without support from grown-ups, and on social media, it's kind of a Wild West. I'm taking some liberties here, but I think that was the gist.
Yeah. It's a huge topic, and there is some really good. Actually, there's a new National Academies report that's just come out in the last year, I think, on social media use for young people. It's complicated. I do think that the social media use of young people, it's a huge area that's constantly changing. I think it's both provides opportunities for connection and imagination of self, and for LGBTQ young people to see possibilities for themselves in new ways. It's also a venue for that same kind of social regulation, peer regulation. And I think the difference is that it's omnipresent. I mean, it used to be that you could go home from school, and now you don't ever go away from your media. And so That's the beginning of my reaction. But tell me the rest of your question. Like, what do we know about how that manifests through victimization and bullying? Yeah. Yeah. Why do people bully? I mean, yeah. I mean, I think this is the one of the dilemmas of talking about this is that it can stigmatize adolescents to like make it sound like, you know, middle schoolers can help themselves, but I mean, and that is actually not what we know. I mean, and we know that actually young people are the ones who are among the most vocal and sophisticated advocates for justice and equality. And so it's a complicated story about why, what happens in peer culture that leads to discrimination and bullying. But, you know, what a lot of the data suggests is that where you live and the context that the adults create around you is what matters. And so how do we create environments where discrimination and bullying are not okay, are not part of what is expected and normal? And how do we support young people to see themselves in positive ways rather than in regulatory ways?
I wonder if I could pick up on this gentleman's question. I wonder to what extent having like the student groups or having enumerated policies, all the positive steps in your framework, how those things would interact in outcomes if you measured also for the degree of social media usage, like even just a straight up measure like hours per day, or even by types of measure. I bet you could do it.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's an interesting idea. I mean, I think that what the school climate and context data shows is that, and what some of the qualitative work on things like GSAs or teacher training suggests that what happens is that it becomes not okay to be discriminatory, and so your question about where does the impulse for that even come from, and I do think it comes from the fact that in adolescence we are highly attuned to ourselves and the degree to which we are fitting in to the normative structures that are the things that we're supposed to look like, feel like, do, look, think, say. And I think that, you know, some kids also see what's around them, in the world around them, in the media around them, and enact those same kinds of, I mean, we saw, there's an article that specifically, you know, one that followed the GSA. The GSA paper from California preceded a paper that was much more on the micro level. It was a week-by-week study in Virginia of bullying in Virginia schools during the 2016 presidential, the fall semester during the presidential campaign, and showed an increase in racial bullying leading up to the campaign. And so, you know, these data look like young people are reflecting the discourse that's around them when they're enacting prejudice and stigma. So it can't be that easy. It can't be that simple. But.
I have a couple of questions from Zoomland. One is from Professor Sonia Jarvis, who is a civil rights lawyer and pioneer herself in some of in voting rights work and other things. She says, "Thank you for your informative presentation. For LGBTQ allies, how best can we help counter the anti-LGBTQ laws and policies that have been dominating local public school board meetings, that may counter the censorship of books about LGBTQ characters and issues that may be blocked from libraries or no longer assigned to classes, and can help confront policies that are targeting trans students? Thank you."
Wow.
That wasn't a hard question, was it?
Well, I mean, I think we have to speak out. We have to think about the ways that we can get involved and be assertive. And we need to, you know, figure out ways to interrupt the, you know, these laws are a concerted strategy. They all use the same language. They all come from the same think tanks. And we need to point that out. They're not coming from the local community. When we've seen, you know, I can speak to what's happened locally in Texas, but when we've had debates in school districts about sex education policy or about an inclusive training for teachers, it actually has not been local people that show up at the school board meeting to, you know, to take all the airtime. And so I think we've got to figure out how in a democracy we can have public discourse and call out the ways that gets derailed and taken over. I mean, it's clear that the majority of, U.S. adults don't. I mean, the anti-trans stuff is such an important moment too, because it's like taking advantage of the thing about which we know the least as a culture. Before 2015, most U.S. adults didn't even know what that was, didn't even know it was a thing. And suddenly, there's no way since summer of 2015 that you don't know what transgender means. And, frankly, when I should maybe stop and hear if there are other, but I think, well, what I was going to say is, the first politicized efforts were the Houston bathroom law that then turned into the North Carolina state law, and those were terrible disasters because the business community wouldn't stand for it. But the business community talked with their dollars and pulled out of the cities and the city of Houston and the state of North Carolina. And what's happened as a result, if you look at the progression of the content of the anti-trans laws, they've now focused on kids, and kids don't have the same kind of business constituent. And we are deeply, deeply anxious about gender and sexuality in children. So it's like a perfect, leverage tool. I mean, I really don't think most American people are that concerned about gender affirmation for kids. And in fact, every single kid needs gender affirmation. Every kid needs gender affirmation, regardless of what their gender is. So it's so basic, and it's like an amazing way that we've taken something that's so basic and human and turned it into, politicized it.
So one of the things that one of your co-founders of the Stories and Numbers Project is the mother of a transgender child. And one of the things that she said in one of our conversations was, I'm so tired of people from the Northeast and the coast telling me to leave Texas. In my daily life in Texas, everybody's nice to me and nice to my kid. There's not a problem locally. There's a problem when you have outsiders who are coming in and trying to create divisions through political means. And you didn't refer to this, but the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, is one of the training grounds that's been funded by like the Koch brothers, and they create templates for these bills, and they're all the same, right? The anti-immigrant bills, the anti-undocumented bills, the anti-LGBTQ bills, they create them, and congressmen and women go in and get trained to use them, and then they show up at the local level all over the country. It's not a spontaneous, it doesn't reflect local popular opinion. I wanted to I'm agreeing with what you said, but it's not like a mysterious, it's not Adam Smith's invisible hand. There's like institutions and money promoting these agendas. So I have several questions here. All right, this is my favorite so far. Is there any evidence to suggest that TV shows like Will and Grace helped parents adjust their negative attitudes?
Wow. That's a great. Is there evidence? Yeah.
We have a history of nonprofit groups dealing on different social issues, focusing on Hollywood and how they depict images of people of color, people who smoke, et cetera, et cetera. And although Will and Grace, many of us would say was not an accurate representation of us, but did it affect adults' understanding and acceptance of their children?
So the follow-up from the questioner was, there's a long tradition in research focusing on how images promoted in Hollywood affect the reality we live in.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not interested. The specifics of Will and Grace aside, I'm interested to know. There must be media scholars who are maybe studying some version of that in terms of like, it's kind of hard to study parents, especially parents of like adolescents, but maybe parents of young kids. I mean, I think that probably I think much of what you've said is the answer, which is that there's a complicated relationship there, which is that the media representations clearly create a space for people to understand, have language, have the ability to even converse about it and think about it. And they also almost uniformly these days seem like, especially the dominant media systems, stabilize certain kinds of tropes about the marginalized and minoritized people that they represent. And so there's the gay man, and there's the black man, and there's the lesbian woman, and those are, those tropes are so, have become intractable in the media. And so, so I think it's both. I think both of those things are true at the same time. And so, on the one hand, it like creates possibilities for people to like understand and not be hung up about their kids, but it may also create boxes that are then hard to get out of. But
All right, we have a question from, I'm going to alternate between Zoom land and in person. Professor Ana de Sosa, a very smart economist here at Marx, asks how you can you please share your thoughts about how to apply some of your fascinating work to higher education spaces.
ooh, that's great. Yeah, I think that's a whole area where we know. I mean, there's less empirical work that has been done, although there's some there's some young folks, young scholars who are doing really, really cool new stuff. I mean, I think that the at the broadest level, I have thought about this. I think that the framework, the sort of 4 strategies, is transferable. I mean, I've talked with folks in child welfare, and I've talked with folks in higher ed about how that framework, we can think about how it can be useful. I think it's the specifics that we need to think through. And I think, I hear it all the time at my university about like, how do we get, I'm in a college of one of the biggest college of natural sciences in the country. How do we get, the biologists and chemists who think that all they need to do is teach biology and chemistry to understand that there are kids in their classroom that are like living in the daily, walking between classes and having a weekend and, trying to get through being a 22-year-old. How do we help, folks understand that? And I think that we do have a lot of work to do on things like training the professoriate on understanding diversities and how that plays out in the classroom and how to engage all of the students that come to us and what their lived experience has been. So I think, I don't know, I'm interested in Anna, send me an email and tell me what you think, if you have an answer that comes with your question, because it's a great question.
Thank you, Stephen. Okay. The next question from the audience. Your findings related to preventing discrimination among LGBT community are astonishing. Can you talk about the transferability of these findings to discrimination directed at other groups, such as by race or class?
Yeah, that's why I think like the litigation article is so interesting, and it's one of the things that Mark Hetzenbuehler, who's at Harvard now, who's led that, wants to do next, is to think about, is this a proof of concept for other axes of discrimination? I think probably that area where we've learned more explicitly, kind of intersectionally, is that example I showed of school suspension and expulsion. And that work really literally came out of the racial disparity. I mean, came out of discussions that I was having with people who were studying racial disparities in school discipline. And my questioning, the questions about whether, queer was part of that, like what's going on. And it turns out, in fact, it is. I mean, it's like it's not just being a black boy, it's being a black boy that also is putting on nail polish. Girls don't get suspended for wearing nail polish. Turns out boys do. And turns out that black and brown boys get suspended even more if they're wearing nail polish. So like it's that. So I think that there are some of these areas that are totally transferable, but I don't know in all. I mean, I have to kind of think through case by case. Though I've been really interested in the Gender Sexuality Alliance, GSA. Like, is it the same? Would it be the same as the La Raza Club? Would it be the same as a global diversity club? And there is not the same. There has not been the same research tradition for understanding the extra, what some people call extracurricular, the sort of non-curricular club activities outside the LGBTQ space, outside of GSAs. And so I'm really interested in that. But I have wondered if the ways that LGBTQ cuts across every kind of social category, that might be part of what's going on with GSAs, that being LGBTQ applies to lots and lots of different kinds of people from different backgrounds and different spaces, and in ways that maybe a cultural group focused group might not. But I don't know that, but I have wondered about that, and it would be, and it's kind of, and I'm probably not the best one to interrogate that, because I'm kind of like, what happens if it turns out that that's not, we don't see the same, glorious results that we see with GSAs? What does that mean? And that doesn't mean that those clubs aren't, essential for our schools. So it's interesting.
I think it's a longer conversation, but the first thing that I thought of from that was a PhD student of mine who's doing work on why and how LGBTQ groups in the Balkans were able to be so unified and effective in promoting LGBTQ rights in the Balkans, which are Balkanized by definition so dramatically, and where that kind of transnational cooperation was not possible. And it's it's obviously a hugely different scale, but that's exactly the logic of her argument, which is that it was this outsider identity as being LGBTQ that united them all primarily and first. And they were tremendously effective. Also, sort of the supranational structures in Europe, but it's an interesting conversation, I think. I have
Maybe, disabilities could be a space to also interrogate, because anyway, there's some interesting case studies of policy change. Like I'm thinking of the North Carolina the inclusive anti-bullying law in North Carolina, where constituent-based advocate groups got together and created a coalition that was non-budgeable. They would not allow, they left the table if one of the groups got left out. And they tried to de-gay the law at the last minute, and the group pulled out. They said, and the parents of the kids with disabilities and the parents of the Latino kids and the parents of the queer kids said, we're in it together, or we're not letting you use our name. We're not doing this if we're not all together. And they went without the law for a year. They were going to have a law, a de-gay law, and they said, no, we don't want to do it. They didn't pass the law, and it came back a year later that was inclusive. Wow. So that kind of story of coalitional politic, and anyway, we can learn from. I don't know that it answers that original question or not, or is related.
I don't either,
to
but I appreciate your
anyway.
ranging beyond the immediate data in the studies to think about the larger structural conditions.
Yeah.
No, I do. And I have two things here from the online world. Professor De Sosa says, haha, I wish I had the answer to that question.
Okay, good. All right.
And Professor Angie Beeman of Marx here has a really an interesting question that dives down into your data. Can you talk more, please, about the SOGI training and why it is associated with less school victimization for LGBTQ students? Is there something specific to that training that makes it so effective? I ask because there are schools with faculty and staff who speak a lot about bullying and how to be a, quote, upstander or, quote, bully buster, yet they struggle to actually reduce bullying, and children don't feel particularly protected by these programs. So what about the practices and policies of these SOGI programs differentiate them from other anti-bullying and other policies intended to protect these children?
This is one of those two-part answers. I have no idea, and I have a whole lot to say. So the I have no idea part is this is the amazing thing about these kind of data. I have no idea what they're actually doing. I mean, I do have some idea because I was in California and I know lots of people that are doing this work in California. But I think I don't know what SOGI training means. I think SOGI training often means anti-bullying because there's a trope of the bullied gay kid. I think that SOGI training often means intervening in harassment and violence and discrimination, but it doesn't always. Sometimes it means just understanding human development and understanding what is sexual identity and what's okay and what's normal and what's not. I mean, that kind of stuff. But I think there's often a flavor of discrimination and harassment in it, and I think that's I do think it's I have no idea. It's like what I suspect is that it's an answer to the second part, which is the bullying. I'm going to take a deep breath and say it in a different way. There's a whole world of bullying prevention. I have yet to see, I was going to say none, but that was about 2 years ago that I could say that. So there may be something new that I don't know about. But 2 years ago, none of it explicitly addresses prejudice and discrimination. And if you look at data from places like California, 75% of the bullying that happens, kids have an attribution. They say it's because of my race, because of my gender, because of my sexual orientation, because of my religion. So if 75% of bullying is discriminatory or rooted in prejudice, and bullying prevention is, sorry, but colorblind, we are really, it is no wonder to me that it's not reducing discriminatory bullying. So, and I don't know the specifics, I should be careful, because I don't know what the upstander stuff, looks like. But if it's not really interrogating power, privilege, and discrimination, I'm worried about it. I'm worried that it becomes behavioral and not really about young people and their understanding of what it means to grow up and be in a democracy and understand other people. And so it's a big fault a big bone I have with the bullying prevention world.
The first thing I thought of, I actually really liked, and so did other people, that you said I have no idea, but I have a lot to say about it. The second thing I thought is, you've established what the effective is, right? You've got you've got the statistics showing what the effects are. You need some qualitative case-oriented research to figure out how these things are working.
Absolutely,
right?
totally.
I think
totally.
that's a key part of it, because I think you do have a lot. You don't have the data to show exactly, because your kind of data doesn't show how.
Right.
But I don't think it would be that difficult to create a study that would show those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And you've got a lot of smart postdocs.
Yeah, no,
people
totally.
To do this.
Yeah.
So let's, we have some other questions. What are the best ways to alleviate concerns that parents and educators have about gender exploration development as part of a natural part of gender identity development?
Yeah. This is so huge right now, and I'm not sure that's going to answer I'm just going to say what I'm going to say, and whoever, they're here, so they could stand up and they could say if this is on target or not. I think one of the things that worries me so much about the ways that trans panic is being used right now is the kind of the way that we have stabilized medical. We've turned the medical intervention into a fetish. And there is a whole rhetoric around medical intervention and hormones, when what we know is that the vast majority, I was in a meeting and somebody said 92% of kids who go for treatment don't need medical intervention. They need psychological intervention. I don't know if that's true. And then if that's 92% of the people that go, think of the vast numbers of kids who are not seeking care, who just need, frankly, gender affirmation. So the thing that I'm worried about is, the point is, I'm worried that we turn this thing about medical intervention into this, somehow there's this idea that a kid has a gender question and suddenly they're going to get a prescription for a hormone, and it really doesn't work that way. There are, of course, entire fields of medicine where experts know what to do to provide appropriate care. And it's dumbfounding to me that we're questioning that. And so the meta message to me is that everybody just needs gender affirmation. Every young boy needs gender affirmation. Every young girl, yeah. Yes, and I think the political media discourse has created this place where a parent really does think, oh my gosh, you must be transgender. Okay, so now we need, and that's scary, or I need to go buy you a new wardrobe. When really, maybe I just wanted to put on a tutu for the afternoon and like see what that felt like. And it did, you know, so I think partly young people are showing us that I mean, this is the amazing thing about young people always in culture, but it's in their moment now for us is that they're showing us that the binary is not, you know, and they're like, I don't know, maybe biological sex is a little bit more of a binary, but not even a pure one. And for me, I'm just going to try to figure it out. And so I think, you know, for adults to, you know, allow for that, you know, lean into it. And then for us to not jump to these conclusions. And then to recognize that there are some times when there are kids, families that need medical care for their kids that includes, you know, pharmacological intervention. And when in that case, that is so far down a line of people who so totally know what they're doing, not enough of them. We don't train enough, you know, gender care pediatricians, but, you know, anyway, yeah.
I think that one of the things you spoke about before was a moral panic on gender issues, trans issues, and I also thought, so I think part of that, if any of you guys remember back to when before Windsor, before gay marriage became a constitutional right, in the early 2000s, it was the end of civilization. If gay people could get married, it was going to destroy the republic, right? And the republic may be destroyed, but it won't be because of gay marriage, right? And so I think there's also policy narratives, right? The issue being defined by public actors in ways that fit their preferred solution to the problem, rather than it being defined by the data, the research, and the science. But I think the concept you talked about before of a moral panic is really important here, because it then goes into the kinds of considerations. Parenting is a very complicated, hard thing to do, and if there's a moral panic about these kinds of issues, it makes it more difficult, I think, for parents to sort things out.
Absolutely.
I'm going to seg into another question here that I think is related to this from online, and it said it was about Texas schools. And Texas isn't usually seen as a very liberal area, but are there a lot of schools in Texas that are receptive to your stories and numbers for strategy framework, and it's not a problematic thing to implement, and then others that are absolutely dead set against it?
That's a great question. I mean, what I think, you know, my experience has been more like there are, and I think this is how change happens, you know, there are actors that are interested and that take it up and use it in different ways. I think we are in a moment, you know, the interesting thing about Texas is the majority of children in Texas we don't have a state law that is inclusive of sexual orientation and gender identity protections for non-discrimination in the state of Texas with respect to education. But the majority of children in Texas grow up in school districts that have great policies. The big urban schools, Fort Worth and El Paso, for example, have some of the model policies in the country for inclusive policies. But all, you know, Houston, Dallas, like all of the cities and the cities that you might not think, like, would they have inclusive policies? They have inclusive policies. I think what's happened, you know, one of those school districts was specifically targeted by the state attorney general for their gender affirmation plan that they had in place for the school district. So I think what's happened is that there is a chilling effect of the, you know, political discourse about like what the policy implementation looks like and what, you know, what degrees of freedom people feel that they have. And so my experience has been that, you know, a school counselor, a principal, a parent, you know, becomes engaged with the framework and, you know, works with it, uses it in their school, talks with kids about it, you know, might use it in a school board conversation. I mean, you know, I know of this.
They have to be adopted by this, like the school board or the school officials have to say, this is our policy, right?
Right. Well, some of them, I mean, this is the part where like turn off the thing because, but like, right now, gender sexuality alliances are, the case law in that area is pretty clear, has been clear till now, that like you can't be told, even in the state of Texas, that you can't have a GSA club because of, so a lot of these things are issues that are settled. They just, the way that they, well, not all of them. I mean, the just enumerated policies and laws not. But again, like most school districts have those. The issue is like what happens at the local level and how it gets implemented. And so when you get an impassioned teacher or parent or young person that says, here's what we can do and here's what we should do, and what the stories and numbers, for those of you who want to go look at it, I mean, part of the stories part is engaging young people in using the information to tell their story through advocacy. So we have a storytelling toolkit about like how do you use research to articulate use the evidence from research to articulate what you've experienced and show that your story is important and it's part of a bigger story and there's research behind it that backs you up.
Can you give us the story you told before about the girl walking past the lawn signs in 2008 was very powerful. Do you have stories about people using the stories and numbers framework and toolkit in ways that have helped them or helped their parents or helped the schools?
Yes, it's really, I mean, I'm kind of shy to think about, I hear stories, but like it's the person telling me this stuff. I don't know if it changed the school. Like, did it change the school? I mean, I hear from my 3,000 teachers in Florida have been, trained using the framework. That's super compelling to me. I'm so proud of that.
It's compelling to me too.
I don't know what it means, right? The teacher, I get calls like that, like we're using, I hear from literally people in town that say, oh, you're the person that they talked about in the training for all the teachers at the back to school session for the school district last week. That's incredibly, that's amazing. And then, when there was the debate in Dripping Springs, Texas about the sex education curricula, they used our fact sheet to articulate why, and the school district, didn't capitulate to the drama. So I don't know, is that, I don't want to, I mean, I can't say that it was my fact sheet that
I can tell
made that happen, but
your modesty is stopping you from telling too celebratory a story here, but I think we can all
it's great. I mean, there's some good
celebrate this
things.
in a very vigorous way. Deanna, how are we? I see it's 7:30. You
It's
haven't
probably
given
time
me
to-
the sign yet, but should we wrap up?
Yeah, we should wrap up.
In a quick. All right. So anyway, I think then, will you guys? I really do think, Stephen, that this work is extremely important, and I'm delighted and impressed with. I mean, you and I had conversations. Like Stephen Russell as a grad student couldn't even have imagined what Stephen
right,
Russell as an old guy, as you put it, has been able to do over this 20 years or so, and the data you've been able to amass, and now you have data on how litigation has an impact. I think you've really opened up possibilities for the productive use of research in the world that didn't exist before. So
Thank you.
I'm gonna give you.
Thank you for that. Thank you to the Edelmans.
I do. I think it's pretty amazing.
Engelman.
The Engelmans, yes.
Thank you to the Engelmans for this great gift.
So,
to your college.
Anyway, I'd like you all to join me in thanking Stephen Russell and everybody in Zoomland. I guess just tap hooray onto the chat and I'll show Stephen. Anyway, thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you.